Chesh, and welcome to another episode. Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about lore. I've got 3 lore questions. One of them is a quick question, and then the other 2 I'm actually quite interested in talking about some pretty cool topics. And yeah, the footage in the background comes once again from MabbyGW, who actually uploaded a video to tell me how to say the name, so hopefully I did it alright that time. Yeah, more from them. You'll find a link in the description down below if you want to check out his other stuff. And yeah, so the first question I want to open up with was something I was toying with possibly doing a spotlight on, but since I kind of already talked about the first half of this story in just a normal question, then I figured the second half really didn't warrant a spotlight all on its own. The question was from Viatus, who simply asked, who were the people in the Crystal Desert? You know, the ghost who leads you through Ascension. And the ghost is Chira Osa. Like I just said, actually in a previous video, I talked about him by proxy of talking about the Order of Whispers, because he was the founder of the Order of Whispers. He created that organisation after becoming a hero in a loner because he saved those people from Palawa Joker, and I told you that whole story of that. Now, the characters, one of my favourite characters, or most interesting characters in the Guild Wars universe, because honestly, the writers don't tend to create compelling characters that have got flaws in them, but Chira Osa is a character that does have a flaw. He's got very 2 different faces, and in one regard he's seen as this great hero that was a saviour of his land, and then you kind of find out some other stuff that makes him seem like not such a great guy after all. You see, he really had an obsession with the arcane, or with becoming something greater. After he saved all of Elona, after all that stuff that I explained before, where he saved his homeland, he kept craving for extra power or something else to do, basically, as far as we can see. And he began to learn of something known as Ascension, which is the process of becoming closer to the gods, as they say. There is a place in Tyria, there was a place where the gods once lived on Or, and near Or, in a great desert, it was said you could ascend and become closer to the gods, and it was this great magical thing that Chira Osa learnt about and decided for himself, hey, do you know what, I want to go ascend, I want to do this. So he foolishly essentially took a massive faction of his people, stopped ruling the land, stopped ruling corners, stopped being this great hero, this great saviour of the land, and gathered up loads of people that lived in Elona and said to them, look, we are destined for something greater, follow me to your salvation, follow me to Ascension. I will make you closer to the gods and give you powers beyond your beliefs, basically. And a whole bunch of people decided that they were going to follow him. To get to these lands where supposedly Chira wanted to ascend, these lands, the Crystal Desert, to get to them, he had to cross something called the Desolation. And the Desolation is this massive sulphurous waste that is almost impassable, very, very difficult for mortals to pass through. You just get poisoned, or you starve, or you die because you haven't had any water. It's just a terrible, terrible, terrible desert land that nothing really can survive in. It was created because it was there in the Desolation that many years ago, when the gods were at war with one another, were at war with Abaddon. That's where Abaddon actually died and fell, and that's where the mortal realm of Tyria is closest to the realm of Torment, or at least one of the areas. The other one's at the Door of Kamali, which I mentioned in another episode. So Chira Osa had to pass through this desolation with all of these people, thought that he could do it, obviously was convinced he was this great hero because of his previous successes in life, and brought all of these people through. And when you play through Nightfall and you get into the Desolation, you will find the ruins of lots of old civilizations of men that tried to live in the Desolation or lived there before it became a desolation, and you will find lots of ghosts and evidence of all the many hundreds of people that died trying to follow Chira Osa north. That's not to say they all died in the Desolation. They did actually eventually get to the lands where you could ascend, the Crystal Desert. The Crystal Desert used to be an ocean. It was the ocean that essentially Abaddon lorded over. Abaddon was the god of water, but in a way, really, you could look at him as the god of the seas, or the god of the oceans, and this was kind of his domain. A long time ago, back while the Crystal Sea was still an ocean, there were a group of seafaring humans that lived there called the Marganites, and it was these people that Abaddon favoured, and when he became corrupt and fell and was at war with the gods, he basically took these people, just humans that called themselves the Marganites, and he made them his chosen. And in Nightfall, it gets to the point where, because Abaddon's now become the bad guy, you're fighting a lot of the Marganites, but they originally were from this land. Anyway, when Abaddon died, owing to the fact that it was kind of his realm, the Crystal Ocean, it dried up when he fell and he lost of his power and he was imprisoned, and when it dried up, it became the Crystal Desert. And all that was really left there was just the mark that this was really a place that was affected by the gods, and this is where you could go to ascend. So, Chira Osa brought all of his people through the desolation up into these lands of the Crystal Desert, and decided, right, we're going to settle here, and we are going to ascend, and we're going to become closer to the gods. Brilliant. The top trumps. This is going to work excellently. Problem was, it's a desert. It's the Crystal Desert, and Chira Osa was not the first person to bring a bunch of people. He was not the first civilization to try and set up shop or camp there in the desert while they became ascended. And many before Chira Osa, and it could also be many after Chira Osa, went there, brought their people there, and died. And just everyone that went and followed Chira Osa, they tried to make a good go of it. And when you go to the Crystal Desert, you can see the ruins of all these civilizations, big towers. It looks like people had real cities there at some point that were, at least for a while, thriving. But the desert consumed all of them. Not just Chira Osa and all of his followers. Every single civilization that has ever tried to settle in the Crystal Desert has died and failed. And it gets to the point where, in Guild Wars 1, when you go to the Crystal Desert yourself to ascend, you are just walking around a wasteland. Not a wasteland just because it's a desert, but a wasteland because there are all these collapsed and ancient civilizations that are now half buried in the sand. And it really is quite a sight. Primarily, though, you will be encountering ghosts of the people that follow Chira Osa. Nightfall, the continent that it's based on, where Chira Osa came from and brought all these people, that continent is called Elona, and all the people that live there called themselves Elonians. However, the guys that followed Chira Osa, this is an interesting little fact for you guys, the guys that followed Chira Osa into the Crystal Desert, when they decided to live there, they called the Crystal Desert Elonia. So they came from Elona, and they decided to establish this new nation, essentially, in the desert called Elonia, and that is actually a valid term in the Guild Wars universe. Elonia was the fallen civilization that Chira Osa tried to build, and I actually once named a character of mine Elonia. It had the word Elonia in its name because I thought that's just what Elona was called, and then I essentially spent my entire time in Guild Wars 1 regretting that name because I thought I'd got it wrong, because it's not Elonia, it's just Elona. And then many years later I found out that Elonia does exist in lore. Elonia is the name of this place that Chira Osa tried to found, and everybody died. So when you ask who were the people in the Crystal Desert, there were many people in the Crystal Desert, many civilizations. The one we know most about were the ones that came from Elona, that were led by Chira Osa, as he doomed all of his people, which is a very interesting twist to his character that I love. He was a great savior, and you find some people in the lore will love him, and they'll say, oh, he's incredible, he's this amazing character that saved Elona, and he really did, he saved them all. But then he had kind of this dark turn where it wasn't enough for him, and he got kind of obsessed with the arcane arts, and doomed many people who blindly followed him, and he let them all down, and he failed, which is very cool. You meet his ghost in the Crystal Desert, and he actually helps you to ascend in Guild Wars 1 at last. Being dead, he can't ascend any longer himself, but he does help you, the player character, figure out how to do it, and you do manage to ascend in the end. One last interesting thing I like on this story and the whole plot of Chira Osa, his great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter is Varesh Osa, who is essentially the big bad guy in Nightfall. She's the big bad guy because she was just like Chira Osa, which is a really interesting connection between their two characters. Chira Osa slowly became obsessed by the thought of ascension and growing powerful and the arcane arts, and that kind of drove him to his death. And Varesh Osa was very much the same. She also became obsessed with this idea of the arcane arts and stuff, except she, instead of seeking ascension, her goal became to bring about Nightfall and free Abaddon from his prison. So they were very similar, these two characters, these two Osas, from many years between them, but they were very similar. And I really think it's one of my favourite characters and stories that they established in Guild Wars 1, just because it's so tragic. He was a hero, and then he just failed everyone. It's really cool. When you go to the Crystal Desert, you get a feel for that. It is one of my favourite regions of the game. The Desolation's probably a little bit better, but the Crystal Desert itself is also very cool. You really do get a feeling for all these people that just died out there. Just died for nothing. They never ascended at all. Anyway, spent a long time on that. I said I didn't want to do a spotlight on that, but this almost was one. I'm going to go to the quick question now, which was from Kerblotheter, who said, I have a lore question. We've been told that the Asura built the central transfer chamber right on top of Prime Orders, which they consider to be just a statue radiating vast amounts of energy to power the Asura gate network. However, we can clearly see that the gates continue to function even after their power source flew away. Does this mean that the Asura found another source of energy, perhaps in Lion's Arch, which has a large concentration of these gates, or did they suddenly realise that they can somehow manage without one. I think it's the latter. There's no law that explains this. I think the Asura have just come a long way since coming to the surface. That's really acted as a catalyst for them coming to the surface, and really, I think, propelled their technology and the way they look at it and how fast they invent and how effective their crews are. And now I think we've just got to the point where the gate technology is really, really well done, and they don't need so much energy. The other thing, though, that you have to remember is that we don't know how many gates were necessarily in the central transfer chamber. At the point that we got there in the storyline, we certainly can go through all of these gates. And we had no clear understanding of how large Asuran civilization was underground. And it was probably much bigger underground than it is actually now when they're on the surface. So we could be talking about hundreds of gates. You won't be able to see hundreds of gates at all, not actually in-game. But in lore, there could have been hundreds of them. And that's why they needed all of this power from this statue or whatever they thought they'd found. That's why they needed it, because they had so many cities and stuff underground. While now, comparatively on the surface of Tyria, maybe they don't need so much. Maybe they don't have a gate for every little outpost as they may have done in Guild Wars 1. I mean, you look at the depths of Tyria in Guild Wars 1, pretty much every little cave has got an Asura gate in there somewhere. And if they're all being somehow powered remotely through the central transfer chamber, then yeah, I can understand them maybe needing that much power. Maybe it's now that when they're on the surface, because they've only got a gate, you know, in each of the main cities, it's not actually as much as it used to be. It's probably a bit of both, actually. They have maybe some less gates in use than they used to have, and maybe they're just far better with power now. A very similar technology that we're now looking at in Guild Wars 2 is the waypoints. That's actually obviously a mechanic that they've decided to go with in the game, but it is justified somewhat in lore in that these are actual Asuran adventures that they've kind of littered all over the place. And that's teleporting people around as well, and they certainly don't seem to need so much power either. But yeah, an interesting question. That's why I went with it. Maybe you can't talk too much about the answer, but it's something I'd never really considered, so I thought it was an interesting question. Wanted to go with it. The last question, which I'll have to be short with, is from Baneblade X, who said, why do you think there are such large differences in the times of each Elder Dragon awakening? Prime Orders, for example, woke up long before all other dragons. Do you think there's any reason for this? Perhaps something to do with how they were put to sleep in the first place, and the order it may have been done? Also, do you know who put the Elder Dragons to sleep, if someone had at all? We don't know who put them to sleep. We don't know why they go in cycles. Why does this happen? Oh, we don't know. Two main theories, really. One, somebody put them to sleep, whoever the hell it was. You can really look at only a few races. We only know of a few races that are older than, like, the humans, or that were definitely around back when the Elder Dragons were last awake. The Jotun have really come forward in that regard. For Guild Wars 1, no one would have really expected the Jotun to have taught us much about the Elder Dragons, but the Jotun seem to know, and have, at least out of all the races, been most open with us about the Elder Dragons at this point. And maybe we know that they were a great race at some point. If I was going to pick any candidate for what race or how they might have brought about the end of the Elder Dragons, if that had to be forcibly done, that is, the Jotun, I'd say maybe they could have done it. They were certainly a very powerful race, not in just brute force because of how damn big they are, but also their grasp on magic and technology as well seemed to have been very high at some point, so maybe they had somehow handled it. We know the Dwarves knew a hell of a lot. They seemed to know a lot, and they still had records about it when we knew them in Guild Wars 1. Of course, now they're pretty much extinct, though, and the only ones that are around have been, like, changed in body and mind, so we don't know whether they'll really be able to tell us too much. At this point, though, we don't know who put them to sleep, and I mean, obviously there's still the theories that the Sylvari, if the Sylvari are working in cycles just like the Elder Dragons, then maybe they had a hand in it. Maybe, but the previous cycle with the Elder Dragons was the same story as this one, and the idea is lots of races came together to do it. And the other theory, actually, that comes along here is maybe nobody actually put them to sleep. Maybe they just destroyed, and this was the initial impression we got when they were last awake. They destroyed, and they were hungry for power, and they just destroyed and destroyed and destroyed and just turned the entire planet into a barren wasteland. Some races maybe hid their heads and managed to survive somehow, but they just destroyed everything until they were just tired, and then they fell asleep on their own. That was kind of the impression we had for a long time. It could be that they were defeated forcibly, but that's another potential thing. Maybe they just sort of wore themselves out. The other thing you ask here about large differences in time between them, that's an interesting question as well. It certainly seems to have a real routine to it and a real pattern to it. It's pretty much, it's not exact, but it's pretty much around every 50 years. Another one wakes up around every 50 years. You'll see if you look at the timeline, there's a bit of a big gap where nothing seems to be documented. That's because those timelines are actually kind of in-law timelines, which is quite cool. So they seem to be timelines written from the knowledge of the characters that exist in the universe. So what I'm trying to say here is that big gap is actually where the deep sea dragon probably woke up, but the races of the world aren't really even aware that the deep sea dragon's about. which is so cool. I love that. It has been about 50 years every time. There's a bit of a gap at one point, but that's just because they don't know about the deep sea dragon. The main question on my mind is not necessarily why is it every 50 years or so. Does that mean that each dragon was put to sleep every 50 years or so? Well, that's probably not going to happen for Guild Wars 2, is it? Because they're not going to jump they're not going to jump time forward 50 years every time an expansion comes out. So, I mean, who's to say if it's going to happen in the lore of Guild Wars 2's time that it wouldn't happen in the lore, you know, last time they were awake, unless something very drastically different happens in the lore of Guild Wars 2 time, which we might expect to happen, actually, when you think about it, because I guess we're all hoping that we're going to end the cycle and, you know, not just put them to sleep in the hopes that in the next 1,000 years someone else can actually end the cycle. I think we're all hoping to end the cycle, so maybe doing that will mean that we can stop this sort of 50 years every time. It takes 50 years to defeat a dragon. Maybe we can end that. But what's on my mind most is every 50 years, Kralkatorrik just woke up, really. What happens in 40 years' time? Are we going to have another dragon? There's nothing that says we won't. And certainly, when you look at the other continents, who knows whether other dragons could wake up there. Cantha is the dragon empire. We know some stuff about some types of dragons that were there that possibly gave them that name, but I think that's a pretty good candidate for at least some Elder Dragon interaction. And if we're not going to assume the deep sea dragon is the dragon to kind of be there and be a part of the plot of Cantha, then maybe another one will wake up there. It's on the table. We don't know if any more are going to wake up at all, but it's on the table there in the lore, so to speculate about it is still perfectly valid. But yeah, who knows what happened in 40 years. Maybe we've seen all of them, maybe we haven't, and maybe it will take us 50 years to put each one to sleep, but that will be very interesting to see how they handle that with the expansion storyline, unless we start going through the Rift or something, but I think that's a little bit too obscure for the majority of players. Anyway, there you go, guys. That's Guild Wars 2 Daily for today complete. Thanks very much for watching. Today's Friday. It's looking more and more like the summary is going to be on Sunday that it comes out, just to give us a bit more time, but hopefully you can understand that, and I guess I'll see you tomorrow for some more mechanics. Leave any questions you might have down in the comment section below, lore, spotlight, mechanics, whatever you want, and I'll get around to it and I'll read it, and yeah, thanks again, guys. I'll see you tomorrow.